Thank you very much, Professor Stocker, dear Thomas. Probably it was even more topical to the discussions we have been having last 4 days, WCRP here, but even to the WMO discourse. Thank you so much. I'm sure there are many questions by many of you, but what we will do first, we will first call up a panel, and panel will be deliberating on 2 questions. I will put in a minute, and after that we will be asking questions from audience to both panelists and Thomas about the combination and presentation. So let me then welcome and invite our distinguished panelists to take a place on the stage. I will start with Professor Stammer again from WCRP. You already know him. Then Professor Dr. Helen Cleugh. She is co-chairing the program of WCRP. Dr. Amy Luers. Here is Amy. Amy is representing one of the key partners in the global sustainability discourse and research, Future Earth, looking into many of the issues from the perspective of, for example, humans and social systems. Last but not least, Dr. Maxx Dilley, he from House, WMO. Maxx is Director of Climate Prediction and Adaptation Branch at WMO. I would like to apologize and send greetings of our last but not least panelist, Maria Yule. Maria Yule is from the National Science Foundation of the United States, and she is representing a group called Belmont Forum, about 28 agencies. She got stuck in Frankfurt and her plane was cancelled, so she will be here probably only tonight, which is pity, but that's how it is. I would like to ask now my assistants to project 2 questions for the panel, if possible. We have heard 2 things this afternoon. First, Ambassador de Alba came to appeal to us to talk about UNSG Climate Summit. And he was very clear. This is a summit about action, about do, about implementing. Then we heard a lecture by Professor Stocker showing what's the current state of the art of the climate assessments, what are the issues left, and what are a potential dangerous pathways of some of the technologies which, for example, are fundamental to achieve anywhere near situation to the 1.5 degree world, which we all adopted, science community and governments, last year then. So my first question to the panelists would be to ask for the question, is the current level of scientific understanding mature enough to provide reliable support and guidance to large-scale investments to mitigation and adaptation? If not, what is still missing? And second, this is more provocative, but it's more actionated. Suppose all of you are in command of $1 trillion US annually, which is currently about 1% of the global GDP. What would you do with this money to tackle the climate change challenge within the first 3 priorities? I would like to ask distinguished panelists to make a short pitch in which they would ask for these questions, and then we go to debate, and then we return to the audience for the overall comments and discussions. So let's go from right to left, and of left to right, and start with Amy Luers on the far end of the table.
Is that good? Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I will touch on the first one, not because they're not both very appealing, but for sake of time. And I would say that, clearly we have sufficient understanding for guiding general direction of action, but not to fully get us, carry it out, not to fully get us there. And to have that sort of, to take us that last stride, if you will, I think a real key part of that is increasing collaboration, not just between disciplines, but also between different sectors. And so let me highlight just in my short time three examples of 3 gaps where I see this real incredible need for collaboration, not just across disciplines, but across sectors. The first is we're getting very strong and even stronger, and we've heard some of that today, in predicting, in the predictions. We need to get better, but I would argue that the tools and understandings of the risks, resilience, and vulnerability of communities in this context is an area that we really need to put at least as much, if not more, investments than compared to the predictions. The second area is knowledge and tools for managing the whole Earth system, or the system as a whole. I often say, you know, that it's a sustainable, resilient, and equitable world is more than the sum of its parts, but we are set up to measure, monitor, and govern its parts. And I believe that there is a significant amount of opportunities for research, both on the science to understand those connections better, and also the social science to figure out ways to govern it in an integrated way more effectively. And the final one is a point which was raised earlier, and it's related to the other two, and that is the better science understanding of thresholds and tipping points. And this connects back to the vulnerability and resilience of systems. But I would say that not just at a global and planetary scale, but also across scales and connected to scales. When I was in grad school and doing research on resilience and vulnerability, I focused very much on many of these issues of thinking about those metrics and resilience. And that was many years ago now, and I feel like there's a lot of advancement that can be made. And I think a key part that its advancement has been made in this area, that could be made in this area, is, you know, historically, traditionally, it's been a very focus on place-based work to understand resilience. And I think now we need to move to really thinking about resilience and vulnerability in a sort of a network-based approach. And that, I think, is a real opportunity both on science, tools, and governance.
Thank you, Amy. And where would you put your 1 trillion if you had a chance?
If I had a trillion? Oh, well, I would put it in 3 different sectors. I would really focus on 3 different systems: the energy system, the food system, and urban system, and work really in a focused way, collaborating across research, civil society, and policy, and private sector to identify the levers in those systems to push it towards a more resilient and low-carbon world.
Thank you. And for those who may not know, the energy system alone, in all its modalities, is responsible for about 85% of the mitigation challenge. So probably this is a very vast choice. Maxx, your turn.
Okay, thank you. Well, Pavel has asked us the $1 trillion question, so to try to answer it, I picked up this book, Valuing Weather and Climate. It's a World Bank, WMO, USAID publication. I'm not an author on it, so I'm not going to get any royalties from mentioning it, but I mention it because I have a slide from it that I wanted to show you. I don't know how to get the slide to come up. There we are. So to answer the first question, I think the science is more than sufficient, and Professor Stalker's talk really gave many good examples of that, so I don't think that point needs to be reemphasized. But I would also point out that the Paris Agreement calls for the best available science, and we have very good available science. So I think I can close personally on that point just by that reference. But when we look at the value chain for climate services, and when I say climate services, I mean the services for policy, which we've already seen many good examples of, but also the services that decision makers in all of these climate sensitive sectors like water management and agriculture and food security and health need. It becomes a very wide range of products and information that are needed by a very wide range of stakeholders at many different levels. And this value chain looks at the the links that it takes to go from the scientific part, which is in the upper part of this diagram, down to the generation of value and socioeconomic benefits, which is what you see on the lower right. And when you look at the links in the chain, the scientific part, if I can call it that, on the upper part of the diagram is really just a part of that system. And we need all of these interactions with policymakers, with sectoral specialists, with farmers, you know, the public health officials, who are the stakeholders that will generate these benefits or not. So to just conclude and try to say something about where to invest the $1 trillion, I can't imagine having $1 trillion. So, but from a very WMO-centric point of view, we are underfunded in that top area. The observational systems need improvement, the models need improvement, more research needs to be done. So I don't think that's going to come close to soaking up a few percentage points of $1 trillion, but maybe we could have a couple billion out of that and put it into that. And then the other part of it, whatever's left, the leftovers, could go into the climate-sensitive sectors, and I would put agriculture and water at the top of that list, and energy probably first, and then ag, and then water, because we need this conversion of the energy sector, really, from a fossil fuel-based one to a renewable one. And because the renewables are so climate sensitive themselves, sun, wind, and hydro, you need a big investment in the climate services that it would take to underpin that, that conversion of that sector. Ag, because it is the food source for the world, of course, but also because a part of the carbon renewal depends on agricultural systems being done in a way that accomplishes that, and water because it's the source of life. So they can have the rest of the $1 trillion after we've got what we need on the systems part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll come back in debate to this notion of climate. Is a climate a sector? Is actually kind of cross-cutting, if you like, mainstreaming to those sectors you mentioned. But let me go first to Helen.
Thank you, and I'm really excited by the billion that Maxx has just passed my way. Thanks for the opportunity. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Professor Stocker has outlined very articulately the quality of the science that has enabled and resulted in the Paris Agreement. So clearly our science was mature enough to answer the questions of, is our climate changing and are human activities the cause? But the challenge that Pavel has posed us now with this question is one that's confronting climate change science or research programs around the world, including the one that I lead. And that's turning to how we can use our science to guide adaptation and mitigation responses. So my answer is both yes and no, and before you all groan and say the typical fence-sitting scientist, let me explain why I say yes and no. I say yes because there is a huge surge in demand for credible and relevant information to manage climate risk, and we're seeing that across all sectors, but the real surge we're seeing is in the corporate sector for reasons that I'm sure you all understand. And if the climate research community don't work with those sectors to provide the information, to use our science, to provide that information and knowledge about plausible future climate trajectories, then these decisions and the risk management will be made assuming historical trends, current variability, or they'll go to another less credible source. So what we have found in our organisation is that by co-design with these sectors who are using our information, even though it might have uncertainty, we actually can make progress through co-design. So I think we have to strive to find innovative ways of using our knowledge and data that's honest and transparent about the uncertainties, but enables our stakeholders to benefit from our decades of wisdom. So that's the yes case. Why do I say no? Because the global climate system is fiendishly complex, and trying to build its digital twin, as my digital colleagues like to call it, that is a numerical model of that system, is hard. But we've made huge progress, as we've already seen. But that complexity gets made even worse by the fact that adaptation and risk management needs information at much finer scales, local and regional scales. And our stakeholders typically want to know about climate risk on that very timescale that's the hardest to predict. That is between seasons, multi-annual to decadal. And there are still many processes and feedbacks that we do not understand well enough to confidently include in our models. So I'm going to put it really simply. Yes, maybe some of our knowledge may not be mature enough, but I'm sure that what we have can provide much better guidance than assuming that the past is a guide to the future. Moreover, if we're to remain relevant and help guide the solutions, then we must be innovative, bold, and work collaboratively, as Amy mentioned as well, to ensure that decisions are made using the most credible climate science. So that's my first answer. Do I have $1 trillion as well?
We have a winner.
So my $1 trillion, well, the first I'd say, and it sort of echoes my two colleagues here, is I would be wanting to spend, I don't know, quite a chunk of it in investing in technologies in the energy sector, particularly in the urban sector around urban planning and how we can build low-carbon cities, and in the agriculture sector. So I'm not going to go on about that. I could. I come from a science organisation, so let me go from there to science. I'd like to keep a little bit for science as well, maybe the billions that Maxx offered me. And I'd put it in 3 places, and Professor Stocker said it before me. We must continue to invest in sustained monitoring, sustained observations, so that we can track any unanticipated consequences, and also assess the efficacy of the measures that we're putting into place. And there's a whole raft of things that I could say there, and I just won't for now, but just to say observations are fundamental. We must put some of those $1 trillion into our modelling effort, including our CMIP, which Professor Stocker spoke of, but also our simulation capability, and improve the realism of our models, and to address some of these long-standing limitations. This would feed into better preparedness, reducing the costs of disasters, as well as providing guidance on mitigation responses around negative emission technologies and geoengineering, again, as Professor Stocker showed us so nicely. And the last one then is to build the incentives and the infrastructure and the innovative science to foster integration across our sciences. That's my $1 trillion spent.
I think that's about it. No money left. Thank you. So let me go first to Detlef and then to end up with our key speaker.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, being at the end of the row, many things have been said already, but let me put them in slightly different words. First of all, the knowledge, is it mature enough? I mean, Thomas, in fact, it's my favorite graphics that he showed, which very clearly demonstrates sort of a relation between the integrated emissions and the temperature rise. And I think there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, there's nothing to be questioned about it. It's just a proof that in fact should lead all us to act. So I think in the sense of mitigation, we do have that knowledge. We do have the proof. I guess the slope of the line might be a question about climate sensitivities and so forth, but this relation about the emission, the integrated emission temperature rise is so solid that this is just enough, in fact, to act. And I think if it comes to temperature limitation, the first thing we need to think about is in fact the mitigation, the reduction of the emission to reduce it. But if it then comes to the adaptation, and for me it's in fact always a pair, it's not either or, there always needs to be a mitigation and an adaptation, and at home we call this actually the sustainable adaptation, because you cannot just think about one, you need to think about two. Actually, that becomes more complex, and first of all, because it involves regional and local information, and regional and local information about climate change, and that's a different animal than just a global number. It also means that we really need to think about what the detailed emission pathways are, because that leads to that change on a regional and local scale. And it also involves, and I'm not a natural scientist, I'm not a social scientist, but really the societies, how they react, how they adopt, how they change. And that actually is much more than just giving us a temperature number or so. It really is a different interaction. And I think that a lot about this has to be learned. And so there's no reason not to stop the mitigation and think about how to limit the temperatures, really telling us in detail kind of how high the dike needs to be raised or so to limit sea level flooding or something like. I think there's really more information necessary, and that includes more knowledge. If it comes, for instance, to sea level rise, of course, it is a question: is the Antarctic ice sheet getting unstable or not? That is also a question about the temperature ice sheet dynamics relation. And so, in that sense, we know enough to start acting, but I think there's a lot we still need to learn, in particular about the local adaptation. Now, if you must have a lot of money, because I'm now number 6 to ask for $1 trillion. I think for me, in fact, the question is really how can we keep this planet Earth habitable? And you all will know kind of the activities of the young people all around this Earth. It's kind of Fridays for Future, very active in Germany. And they have a very nice slogan that I liked very much: there is no planet B. Basically, we have to stay here. Of course, we could spend the $1 trillion to fly away, but essentially the basis is we have to keep that planet habitable, and that for me in fact has 3 priorities. First of all, we need much better climate change information that relates to what I said already, down to the local scale, information that can be used for adaptation, and that actually is information also about emission pathways, predictions of those, which I'm not sure if we ever can get to that. Now, the other one is, of course, the climate information gets better by better climate models. We have heard that, by better observations, in fact, to, first of all, better process understanding, but also monitoring the measures we implement for limiting climate change. But certainly better predictions also includes a better models and higher resolution. So to some extent, I would spend the money also for much bigger computers that allow us, in fact, to do this down to the regional and local scale, the prediction. Now, we will not just by better climate information reduce the emission, but we really need to spend some of the money on technology development. And that can be some of what Thomas Stocker talked about, of course, with all the caveats involved. But I think we also need to spend the money and think about how to prevent emissions by better technology. And I think this is really something we need to spend money on. Technology we develop in electric cars. Think about also the consequences of electric cars, maybe alternative energy to generate the electricity that you need and so forth. And last but not least, keeping the planet habitable means really environmental problems. And so climate change is just one part of environmental problems. And I think at the end we need to think about it. If it comes to ecosystem change and all these impacts, how we deal with the environment is really a very important part. And at the end, it really involves transition or transformation of society. And as I said, I'm a natural scientist. I don't know what it means at the end. We really need to invest it. Our lifestyle, our way of dealing with iPhones and whatnot, every year a new one, really reduce our way of living. And I think we need to invest in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I go to Thomas, let me pick up, if I may, on the last point. And I was actually going to challenge you with that. Everything we heard so far was a category what I would call a physical, maybe biological, maybe chemical, numerical ICT type of science, right? There was some excursion made by Amy, but not really that specific. Maxx, and last comment of Detlef was to this effect. If you would be advising Secretary General WMO, who is still in the room, what kind of additional focus you should promote as a sponsor to this discourse of the integrated climate understanding, would you say something about economy, about behavioral economy, about institutional change, about governance? I mean, in the end, these are democracies which are governing the world, and we are individuals, and it comes to all of us how to behave. So what should we do as a community to sort of make the step next towards a transformation which Detlef kind of started to talk about? And I mean, I would like to hear you further, because this is quite a step, right? Quite a step to sort of add, but maybe change a little bit of our discourse. I mean, the only supercomputers resolving Earth in 1 kilometer are fine, but is it enough? And Thomas, start please.
Thank you very much. I think it was already mentioned here and there in the interventions of the panelists. Of course, climate change is one of the biggest challenges. It's not the only challenge that we have on that planet, and that also implies that other disciplines and other stakeholders need to be in this discussion and this dialogue. I think of economy. I have wished for a long time that the scientific discussion started much earlier with my academic colleagues in economy. Now they have realized that they can win a Nobel Prize with climate economy, and I hope that accelerates that interest of that community a little bit, because it's from these thought centers that actually new ideas could spread, that it's not only about cost if you make a transformation to a non-fossil fuel world, but it's also about opportunities and foremost about new jobs that will be created. And we're missing those voices that give the dollars to that topic. We have the voices that give degrees Celsius and millimeters per year, but not those that give the dollars to that topic. Then another area that I think often accelerates the public discussion and the preparedness of people to implement new models is health. Climate has a huge impact on health, as is already evident in certain areas of this planet. Comes from physical climate simulations to show us the limit of physiological adaptability. It's actually quite close. If you go to the hottest points on this planet, combine it with high levels of humidity, these are not livable conditions anymore. And we are moving into that area, and therefore the whole health sector, I think, would be useful to have on board and have a good conversation with people from that sector. What are the long-term implications of climate change? And finally, the corporate world was mentioned as well. I think without the corporate world, we will not be able to confront and tackle the challenges that are associated with that great transformation. Because the corporate world can actually tell us that this is an opportunity. If climate scientists say this is an opportunity to build a new infrastructure, that's probably not so credible. We give numbers to the system. We show where the system would evolve to if Paris targets are not met. But the real down-to-earth discussion with health, with economy, with technology, and the corporate and financial world, that needs to be accelerated. And all these elements, I believe, are in the United Nations family.
Thank you. I'm certain Amy would like to comment on the aspect of the behavioral social science, but I mean, indeed. I mean, this is the kind of mix of the soup which we are trying to cook together. But there are still a couple of hurdles to go over. For example, to engage effectively with the private sector, as you put it, right? And the finance sector, that's something which WMO is now trying to discuss again in an effective way. I think the whole UN system is a little bit struggling with that proposition, so there are still steps to be made together. But let me go to Amy. You are representing a community which is working on the social and institutional and behavioral transformation. So how would you help? How would Future Earth sort of step up to this challenge and partner with us to come together with a one voice in the science discourse and the science policy advice?
Thank you. You know, I think that at that intersection, one thing that hasn't been addressed but is so critical, and the sort of trade-off of the integrated assessment role, as well as those dialogue across sectors and with society, which are so important, is, you know, just facing some of the tough questions at that intersection, which I don't think as a society we're sort of set up to do, partly because of the way our science is structured and partly because of the governance, as I was saying before. And so we think about, you know, we know these intersections between climate and biodiversity and food and equity. We know that there's intersections in terms of the changes and how it's affecting, but there are also serious intersections in terms of the solutions choices and the solution space that plays out between those. And they're really pretty serious questions that we have to ask ourselves as we make those decisions. And I think it is at that intersection of, thinking about those integrated assessments, not in isolation, but in conversations, to be able to then bring to, in the context of UN discussions as well as regional and local discussions, what is really the solution space? Not what is the solution scenario that one sector will do and others, but what is the solution space that when we bring our values in, that we can really have a discussion about.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, we don't have a disagreement on this side of the table. This is of course good, but also a little bit boring for the discussion. So let me open up to you, to the questions, to comments, both to the discourse here, but also to the questions of the main speaker presentation here. So please state up your name and use the microphone. That's basically what we need to do. And whom are you addressing with your question? Maybe that's the one. So let's go first with Martin.
So my name is Martin Wispek. I'm one of the JAC members, and thank you very much, Thomas, for I think was an exciting lecture that you shared with us, and I think I really enjoyed your perspective on where we are in understanding climate science and also where new challenges are. But I also, Pavel, enjoyed the panel very much and the kind of our colleagues' view. But I came away a little short in both of the presentations, and I think, Thomas, you alluded a little bit to it. Where is the future for humanity on that planet that you had on your slide, that little blue marble there? And I must say, from putting a little bit my International Science Council hat on, or what I know about the UN system, in the same year that we're very proud of the Paris Agreement, we also signed the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which I think does exactly, Pavel, what you were asking for, that brings together these various strands, Amy, that you alluded to, that these goals, these 17 goals that we have. Now, I know the world is very confused about how to deal with that, and isn't that something for us in the academic community and in the UN system to work together on? So I think for the WMO, you have a lot of those important elements. You have reach into the decision-making in many countries of the world. You have service expertise. You have authoritative voice on some elements. But I thought the key element in moving forward here is one of partnership. Amy, you pointed that out in your comments, and I think for the World Climate Research Program, just as much as WMO, working on these essential partnerships to really map out that solution space. Now, climate is one dimension, Thomas, I agree. Elevating poverty is another one. Thinking about biodiversity loss is another one. Safeguarding our drinking water is another one. And then there's the economic dimensions about jobs and growth and certainly social equality. Now that means many expertises from the academic world need to come together here. So we can use the International Science Council as a convening power. We can use the UN family, where WMO is an important one. But we can also use our friends in the private sector and in civil society to come up with perspectives. But I'm missing a little bit that global map towards the future, and I'm worried very much that we put one of the agendas, let's say climate in this community, biodiversity this week, with the report from IPBES coming out, and I'm sure we have next week a poverty report, and the week after that one on health. But I think the society wants a joined-up answer. And isn't that something that we collectively in partnership arrangement should be working on, building on the expertise that the World Climate Research Program has, the WMO has, but really recognizing that we need others to come into the discussion and into the tent?
Thank you, Martin. Let me do two things. First, to challenge the panel to sort of respond to it. And then I would like to go to Petri, because he could give us kind of how WMO thinks about partnership in the future, because partnership is a key word on our strategy. So I would like to turn to Petri to comment on this. Please.
Yeah, maybe I start, and I'm pretty sure that down the table there will be other answers. But I completely agree, Martin, that these sustainable development goals are very important for us for sort of mapping out the problem. And we should not forget that some of these goals are in fact sort of contradicting each other. You might never actually reach all. So I think this conflict, there might be real conflict. I'm not sure if conflict of interest is the right word, but there could be really problems in reaching them all. But for me, it's kind of mapping out a landscape. And so if these are the goals, and we are the partners, I'm sort of represented here around the table. In fact, earlier today we talked about that we jointly would make this drawing. And there's a landscape, and which organization would come in where with what expertise, and at the end we want to solve the entire problem all together. But of course not everybody can solve it alone. I mean, you really need them all together, and I think this is really what we need to do now in the transformation, getting fit for purpose for the future, a very important aspect. And so we as WCRP think, first of all, not alone, but start to do something, but then the next step is really this consultation and interaction and mapping out that landscape would be my first answer.
And then to Helen on the table.
I couldn't agree more with Martin. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals are sort of the overarching goals that we need to achieve. 2030 is pretty close, but what I think is really an opportunity here of the 17 goals you can actually identify. I haven't found a robust way how to do that, but you can identify goals that allow you to tackle several problems with the same goal. In other words, goals that show synergy. And if you look at the problem of climate mitigation, there are at least 5 or 6 goals. If you go towards those goals and work very hard, you do a lot already for climate mitigation as well as climate adaptation. And I think the key of the next years will be a conversation across all the organizations to identify those common goals of the SDGs that actually allow you to make multiple achievements, because the time is really short.
Thank you. Before I go further, this reminds me actually one thing which we should discuss, going back a little bit to this, during the 2015 Sustainable Summit, the SDG. At that time, I was at YASA, and as you probably know, YASA was helping very much to the UN system to calculate some numbers behind those. So SDG 7 is the energy. I remember we produced SDG 7 Big Round Report, which was called Global Energy Assessment, and then it was adopted. And I remember after this big celebration in 2015 September, there was a dinner hosted by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon together with some of the European commissioners, and it was Johan Rockström and Jeffrey Sachs, and I was there as well, telling to Secretary General at that time following story. We should be not only happy, but we should celebrate double. We should build a road from New York to Paris, because by agreeing on SDG 7, together with SDG 13, there is 85% job done. So don't go to Paris asking for same money again. And then Secretary General said, dear professors, you are naive, because the system, how we negotiate, requires me to go to Paris to ask for the climate commitment. So there is an exact issue on table. Even the numbers are clear. We still need to understand the political system, how this message could be transponded from one to other place in negotiation. So just an example. Helen wanted to speak.
So of course, Martin, you're right, and Detlef and Pavel and Thomas have all spoken to that. And I guess where I was, sort of Thomas went there actually, I think we need institutional changes, we need partnerships, which Detlef spoke about, and I agree with that. So I think what I'll add to what we need to do that to enable what you're saying is, as well as institutional and partnerships, is ways that we can integrate our science, and I don't just mean in a modelling way. I mean, many of us are sitting down trying to do this, and we find we don't speak the same language. So there's a whole, and that was what I meant actually in my third way of spending the trillion, was actually the incentives, the infrastructure, but I'd actually add institutional as well, and the innovation that enables us to work together so that we can do exactly what you said, Thomas, find out what that solution space is, find out by addressing these X goals in this way, that's going to deliver multiple benefits. But I'm not sure that our model systems and our science and our conceptual frameworks and our institutions are there yet. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I totally agree with your point. That is absolutely the framing we should be thinking about.
Petri, would you like to share with us how WMO is facing this challenge of partnership, which is fundamental for any progress?
Yeah, perhaps I could continue from what Thomas was saying, that the Sustainable Development Goals, they are the Bible of the United Nations at the moment, since most of them are somehow related to weather, climate, or water issues, there has been a growing demand of our expertise, and that's obvious, and that's why, for example, World Health Organization has been very eager to cooperate more with us. FAO, World Food Programme, UNFCCC, which is of course running the COP, and also transport-related players, IMO, ICAO, but also the finance institutions. They have built new partnership with us. We are very much dealing with World Bank and Green Climate Fund, for example, which are going to invest not trillions, but millions actually billions to early warning services and climate adaptation, and we are very much assisting them. But if I would wear the United Nations hat, I could say that we have been achieving a lot as United Nations. The situation on this planet with many indicators is better than ever. That's the health situation, it's a welfare situation, position of women, education level of the people, and so forth. And there are only two indicators where we have challenges. It's those climate-related indicators and then population growth. Population growth has been a little bit a taboo in the UN system, and there are some religious factors behind that, but that's something that we should also promote much more in the future.
Thank you. Let me go back to you for a question. There was a second one here. I see you there.
Thank you. Janos Pastor from the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I have three very quick questions. The first two to Thomas Stocker and the last one to Amy Luers. The first is, you mentioned that the capacity to do modeling and scenario work should move from the research centers to somewhere, but you didn't say where. So my question is where? Should it come to WMO? Should it come to some countries, some new entity? So that's the question. Second one, it's about your comment on geoengineering, and in particular, of course, stratospheric aerosol injection. The way you describe the scenario, I would share your assessment of the risks, yet the people who do think of promoting this as a potential additional tool, they're not talking about that sort of scenario. It's more like a supplementary scenario to reduce the temperature for a while in order to allow the world to decarbonize fully. So in that situation, of course, the risks that you mentioned are still there, maybe in a different way, but they're still there. So the question is, what should the international community do to get the answers from research and in order that people can make decisions whether or not to consider this technology? Because it's sort of hanging out there as a potential, but we have to figure out whether we would want to go for it or not. And Amy, my question, I decided the question earlier, but then the discussion we just had was perfect. So it seems to me that what we have is, we have SDGs, we have different institutions, we have all kinds of bits and pieces, the parts, as you were saying. And what we do not have is that, you use the expression, Earth, manage the whole Earth system. How do we connect this? If you could say a few more words about what you had in mind of how that might happen, because I think that's the challenge that was described by the different speakers. Thank you.
So let's start, I think, with Thomas, right? And then go to Amy, answering the questions.
Well, thank you, Janos, for these important questions and for the opportunity to go a little bit more in detail, although very short. Where should the modeling go? Of course, I have some thoughts, but I think it should also be a discussion among the climate science institutions who up to now have already invested a lot of money and effort into climate simulations. I could think that the European community would be in a good position to actually launch a big effort in climate scenario development and calculation, but I'd rather see actually a global effort involving many countries across the globe to do basically what 100 years ago the individual nations did in the face of weather forecast. What did they do? They organized and founded agencies in their nations. That was a very nation-centric view and has had a lot of success, and we wouldn't want to do without it. But today we have the question of at a global scale, and therefore I think the answer needs to be global. Regarding your second question, yes, I'm aware of these variants to geoengineering. I would call them surgical geoengineering. I'm skeptical there as well, basically because of the human factor, number one, and number two, the governance of such a methodology. The governance that has to deal with questions, for example, what if the monsoon next year comes 2 weeks later? And we know that we have started last year a large-scale surgical geoengineering experiment to slow down global warming. What do you do there? How do you handle that situation? What is the liability? Who decides? For me, as a climate scientist, these are unsolved problems. Perhaps there are organizations or institutions who have thought deeply about that, but I see fundamental problems there. I also see fundamental problems in our ambition to really make the transformation away from fossil fuels. I'm personally convinced that the money that is invested in geoengineering at large scale, at global scale, that money will be not available for other technological innovation to make the transition from fossil to renewable.
Thank you. Amy, how do we organize the Earth system stewardship and supported by good science? That's the question basically to you.
Thank you for that. And just circling back a little bit on Martin's question, because I think what you did is actually characterize bringing in the SDGs to what I had already talked about in terms of the needing for these solution space across these pieces. And I wanted to highlight that in the context of your comment, because we thankfully do have the Sustainable Development Goals as a policy framework under which we can move forward and have that authority to begin to think about that. The challenge is, of course, moving from measuring parts and governing parts is quite challenging. I would propose two pieces that could help us move in that direction. One is, I've had meetings with various different people involved in different countries who manage the SDGs, and typically those people who are in charge of measuring them measure things, and they do it really well, and they are creative about it, and they absorb those challenges. But what is the task given to them of what to measure doesn't include those connectivity. So imagine if you were in a place and instead of just measuring the ecosystems in the different world and if they're keeping track, you also manage the network of connectivity. And the challenge was, well, how do you measure that network of connectivity? And then how do you increase the science about that? And then how do you govern those connectivity? But that sort of thing provides feedback loops then that allows us to look at the connection across scale. Another example of how one might consider doing that is what I had mentioned earlier, is that we produce these reports in climate and biodiversity, in food and equity, and the tough questions are at that intersection. It's looking at that solution space of the intersection. So maybe one of the things you could consider is to say, okay, well, if you look at the solution space, not just the interactions of the changes that are happening, if you look at that solution space and say, what are the really big questions to address these at that intersection? And what are not just the biophysical changes, but the social and equitable and real ethical existential questions that we have to be asking ourselves, and put those at the center of the next big assessment reports, to say, let's really ask those questions and answer those questions at that multi-scale level, and that's beginning to think about the whole system.
Thank you. There was a question down there first, and then we go back to here. We can overrun a little bit because we started, but not too much, because there is a reward waiting for us soon upstairs. I will come to that later. So, please.
So several sources like James Hansen, Professor Tom Krauser from the EPFZ or the Climate Institute declared that there is global warming accelerates, that there is already an acceleration of global warming. So it would be great if you can monitor this and test it. And the second thing, several authors do, like Elena Cardozo, Natalia Shakova, and the Climate Institute again, expect methane emissions from the undersea permafrost within 20, 30 years with large jumps of Earth's temperature. Again, do you think it's will you monitor it and monitor it, watch it, and warn us as soon as possible?
Can you please share with us your name and affiliation?
My name is Dorota Rotelska. I'm part of Climate Association Geneva.
Thank you.
And
who would like to answer these two questions? Maybe Thomas to start with.
Well, very briefly, I'm not quite sure what variable you have in mind that makes you say acceleration of global warming. Is it temperature? Is it regional temperature? What we do know is that sea level rise seems to have picked up, and there are studies out there that actually talk of an acceleration of sea level rise, and if that is a robust finding, not yet assessed, by the way, by IPCC, but if that is a robust finding, then that is an important new knowledge, because sea level is something that reacts slowly and integrates a lot of information of changes in the climate system. So that would be quite disturbing, in fact. But there are other quantities that do not accelerate. I've shown you the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, where I pointed to the fact that it's actually very dangerous to look at short time series and draw conclusions. And that would be really a pitch for continued very careful observations. And that directly points to your second question, observation of emissions of methane, for example, in the boreal areas. That is certainly on the radar screen of individual research institutions. It's within the reach of satellite platforms as well. So I think given that these observational platforms actually are continued and enough finances are around to carry out Earth observations, then yes, I think we are in a good position to monitor.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions. I saw two hands, and then we close down. So, Tom.
Tom Peter from Zurich, one of the JSC members. Thomas, you made two intriguing, which I found intriguing statements, and I would like to further ask you about that. You said we should move health aspects a bit more into our focus. And a print media comparison between Montreal Protocol and the media response after that, and the Kyoto Protocol and the media response after that, indeed revealed that health aspects were a major difference. Now, your example, namely the hottest spot on Earth and so on, didn't really convince me, because the average person will say, I'm not living at the hottest spot. But almost the average person said, I might be in danger by skin cancer due to ozone loss. So that was helped the Montreal Protocol process. So would you have a recommendation on what could be done similarly in the climate regime? My second question connects to what was asked before, the geoengineering issue. Early on, you said geoengineering, dangerous interference, and then lower down, you smuggled a little bit the word may be a dangerous interference in there to leave a little bit open the door. So would your recommendation to the WCRP actually be not even to think about considering investigating that, or what's actually your point there?
Well, thanks very much, Tom. Just very briefly on the health issue, of course, you can emigrate from areas where you have coincidence of high temperature and high humidity, and I would admit that these areas are still limited. But there are studies around that look at the number of days, for example, where you have a higher risk of having a heat stroke. And it's just impressive. I'm not a specialist on these studies, but it's very impressive how these areas not only increase in expansion, but also in severity, that is the number of days per year, which affects hundreds of millions of people if you go RCP 8.5. So that's one thing. In Switzerland, as you know very well, we are not far from health impacts either if you think about extreme events. So heat waves such as the 2003 heat wave in Central and Western Europe caused premature deaths of vulnerable people, mostly elderly people. And if you have heat waves occurring at a higher frequency and bigger intensity, that of course affects your health. Then there are issues about water resources, etc. We don't need to go in there. Regarding the geoengineering, your concrete question, should WCRP basically avoid that topic? Here I respond as a scientist. Science is free to investigate within the ethical bounds that this community gives themselves. And I think the time is actually ripe to start that discussion. What are ethical bounds of global interference? Other topics and other colleagues in science have had to be confronted by that question as well. And, you know, nuclear proliferation, for example, a big topic. And so I think it's time to actually engage in a very serious ethical discussion, and that goes across the disciplines. But fundamentally, I feel safer to actually look quantitatively at the consequences of either full geoengineering or even surgical geoengineering. And there I'm really hoping at the next level of climate models that allow us to, for example, respond to the question, what does it mean for the water resources in India if we decide to surgically geoengineer and tune down the temperature somewhat? Because it has unintended side effects. You cannot completely undo climate change.
Thank you. I don't seem to see any. There is one last very pressing question. Pascal.
So that's the last question. Pascal Bracono, I'm also in the WCRP GSC. So the question is about education, because we didn't hear a lot about it, and you discuss as if science, connection with science would be there to solve the question of action somehow in the discussion. But we also sometimes the feeling that part of the question that come back to science sometimes are questions that society itself does not know how to handle, just maybe because there's not enough capacity building or education, or people are not at the level where they can really discuss the problem we are facing, something like that.
Education is actually one of the SDGs. So it could also involve and include climate education, among many, many other things that are so important for basic civil society taking charge of their own decisions. And so I fully agree, education is important. We have to break down our often complex messages out of our science to the levels of younger people. And in that respect, I find it really heartening to see that to some extent we have actually succeeded. If you look at the movement that has surfaced since the beginning of this year, essentially after the young people, right? Right, after the World Economic Forum It seems that, and I could follow the discussions on platforms in Switzerland, the young people who engage themselves now in these climate manifestations and strikes are extremely well informed. And they can formulate the questions, they can formulate, they know about the processes in the climate system that can potentially lead to a crisis. So to some extent, I think climate education has done the first step into the right direction.
Ladies and gentlemen, we probably explored what we could explore before we go up for the reception. I will announce it in a minute. Before we do that, let me propose we give a big hands to our panelists, to our colleagues who shared with us their thinking and their thoughts. Big hands, please, with me. So really, really great thanks to all of you, and I think it was a great debate with a lot of engagement. We will have everything published very soon. As you know, this was a live broadcast. We are also recording, and we will have everything on the WMO website very soon, so you could revisit and discuss maybe through email forum. Thanks to one of our WMO very active and prominent members, which is the Swiss Meteorological Service. We are now going to move to the up floor here, 8th floor, actually it's 9th floor, cafeteria, for the reception, where we probably continue some of the discussions there. So I would like first to thank the Meteo Swiss for hosting us and invite you to go to the top floor of this building to enjoy each other company. Thank you very much again.